All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Edgell. I'm a college coach at ESM Prep's London office, and I am super excited to be joined today by Victoria Bagnall, who is one of the co-founders of Connections in Mind, and she is here to talk to us about executive functioning and help us support students, whether they are our own students or students that we're working with, especially during this difficult time of having just returned to school after months of remote learning, which I think has been quite hard on students and families that have students. And so we are here to learn how, what that impact looked like and how we can help mitigate it. So I'm going to hand over to Victoria, and I will sort of be in the background monitoring the Q&A. So if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A rather than the chat. And we will address the questions at the end, but feel free to post them as you think of them. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So I will pass over to you, Victoria.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. That's wonderful to be here. And thank you so much for inviting us along. Just to let people know, I'm joined today by my PA, Carly, who's there. She's going to go off video now, as Rachel is, just so that you guys can see me talking as I'm doing my presentation. But Carly's also going to be popping in some links into the chat for you. And the first link she's going to put in is a handout for you. So we've created a PDF. And if you click on the link that Carly's going to post, then you should be able to download the handout, which has got all the information of what we're going to be talking about today on there, and also some helpful resources for you to use at home as well. So Carly, if you could do that and then go off video for me, that would be great. Wonderful. Okay. So I just talked about the the handout. It's also got lots of clickable hyperlinks in it as well. So there's all sorts of resources from us as Connections in Mind, or just generally from people we think are really great at supporting executive function development. So please do take a look at those at your leisure. I'm going to be doing a presentation for about 40 minutes today, followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box as they come to mind. So you don't need to use your working memory to try and remember what you wanted to ask at the end. So just pop them in there, and then we will answer the questions at the end. We should have about 20 minutes to do that. So the aims for this talk today is I want to cover what executive functions are, the neuroscience behind executive functions. Don't worry, we're going to keep it basic. The impact of executive function challenges on learning, and then strategies to help boost executive function development. And we're going to be doing that in the context of the pandemic and the home learning that we've all been doing, and some areas still continuing to do, and thinking about that, the impact of that specifically. So I would like to start off by finding a bit about you. I'm going to go into who I am in a minute, but I'd like to hear a bit about you. So if you'd like to log on to your web browser and go to www.menti.com and use the code 11243053, so it's 11243053, then you should be able to describe yourself or your child in 3 words. So just choose 3 adjectives to describe them. So we're just going to leave that up for now. If anyone's having any problems getting onto that, I don't know if Rachel and Carly, if you could help anyone who's having any problems getting onto that. Okay, great. They should start popping up in a minute. I'm going to describe my child. Well, I've got 3 children actually. I'm going to describe some of those so that we've got some ideas. So I think gregarious, adventurous, and opinionated probably would be some of the ones that I would use. What about the other ones? Outgoing, caring, and insightful. So I'm hoping this is going to come up. Sometimes it does get a bit stuck, so I'm just going to go backwards and forwards and see. Oh, here we go. Wonderful, curious, passionate, and joyful, stubborn, talented, wonderful. I wonder if we've got any more going to be coming up for us here. Curious seems to be one that's really featuring highly, so that's lovely. Conscientious, caring, talented, brilliant, wonderful. Thank you so much for giving those. I'm going to get you involved in more things like this. So keep menti.com open on your browser, and I'll get you involved in more things just to keep your attention during the presentation today. So I always like to tell a bit of a story about why I'm here today talking to you, because I think that helps frame, we know that the human brain learns best through stories. So I have a diagnosis of dyslexia, but despite my challenges with my executive functions as a result of my dyslexia, I managed to work really hard because I have really strong executive function skill of goal-directed persistence, or grit, resilience. So I managed to overcome my challenges, get a place and succeed at the University of Cambridge. I'm also a mother of 3 gorgeous girls, and the co-founder of Connections in Mind and The Code, which is a tutoring organisation that sits alongside us. I'm a trained teacher, and I come at this from a teaching perspective, but I've now been working in the field for over 6 years. So I'm kind of bringing psychology and teaching perspective today. So a little bit about my light bulb moment now, how I got to find out about executive functions. And we tend to find that people who have executive function challenges tend to have a bit of a light bulb moment where they're like, oh my goodness, this is what's been going on for me all of my life. So here I am in Uganda, which actually I'm speaking to you from Uganda today. But this is where I first came to Uganda, and I was volunteering, helping ladies learn English as a foreign language. And I had done this as a result of a crisis, and one of the many mental health crises that I experienced as a young woman growing up. And these crises that I experienced were related to anxiety and depression, because I felt that I was lazy, that I was a bad friend, that I was really forgetful, that I was super disorganized. And all of these things led me to believe that I wasn't good enough and that I was a bad person. And so it led to these mental health crises. And that's because I've been told throughout my life growing up that everyone else found these things easy, but I didn't. And I found them difficult. And why couldn't I just do it? If I was intelligent enough to get to Cambridge, then I should just be able to remember people's birthdays. And I should be able to remember to switch the heating off when leaving my mother's aromatherapy studio when I was about 14 and ruining all her essential oils. So, this kind of underlying executive function challenges had a real impact on my mental health growing up. But it wasn't until I was working on a particular case with a young lady who had a very similar profile to me. And when I left teaching, I went into tutoring. I was working on her particular case, and the psychiatrist on the case said, look, we were discussing her one day, and she said, look, you just got to read this book. It's new out. It's called Smart but Scattered Teens. And it's all about helping young people with executive function challenges. I read this book and I was like, oh my goodness, this is my light bulb moment. The author, Peg Dawson, was doing some training in Boston. So I jumped on a plane from the UK, headed over to Boston and went to her training, took her out for lunch, was like, you have got to come to the UK and you've got to train people in this in the UK. We just need this so much. And it was at that training where we got Peg Dawson to come over that I met my future business partners, Imogen Moore Shelley and Dr. Bettina Honan in the middle here. And we set up Connections in Mind back in 2016. And now we have an organization that works with schools and businesses and individuals and youth centers and all sorts of different areas, helping people to develop stronger executive functions. We have a coaching organization that does executive function coaching, helping people to get stronger executive functions. We also have a foundation working with children who face multiple disadvantages to help them to improve their executive functions. And then we have the Code, which works as a tutoring approach, but with that lens of executive functioning, which I'll come on to in a second. So what do? We do coaching and Connections in Mind, but we work with children from 6 all the way up to 65. So all the way through the age ranges, we work at helping people with executive function challenges. And that's really because we started off working with children, and then the parents came to us and said, help, I need some help on this too. Can you help me? So then we developed our adult offering too. Okay, so I want to know a little bit about your knowledge of executive functions now. So if you could rate your knowledge, so have you never heard of executive functions before, or do you feel that you're rather an expert in this area? So if you go back to menti.com again, so hopefully it should still be open there, and then type, and then just answer this question for me. So rating your knowledge, do you feel that this is something you don't know about, or that you're a bit of an expert? Good. So we've got some people saying that they know quite a bit about it. Wonderful. Kind of in the middle. Fabulous. Great. I'm going to let a few more answers come in so we get a good picture of where we're at. And this will just help me to frame the rest of the slides for us today. Okay. Great stuff. I'm going to move on now. So given that you're all quite familiar with executive functions, I'll whiz over these slides. I just want to just quickly go over them just so that we make sure that my understanding of executive functions is the same as yours, which I'm sure it is. So they're the cognitive processes which reside in the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which is the bit of our brain behind our forehead. And they are responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks, which is why they're called executive functions. It's not because we're training little CEOs, but actually it's because it's about executing tasks, getting things done. And we've only really known about them in the last 20 years or so, since we've been able to use MRI scanners to look inside the brain when people are alive and see what's going on using these scanners to see what parts of the brain are lighting up when we do different functions. So previous to that, we often used to think of these things as character flaws, but now we understand that actually they're not character flaws at all. They are to do with cognitive processes that can be improved, and I'll talk more about that later. So every single person on this earth has a unique executive function fingerprint with strengths and challenges in different areas. So this isn't just for people who have a diagnosis of neurodiverse conditions such as ADHD or ASD or dyslexia or dyspraxia, but actually everyone can do with working on their executive function skills. And our executive functions impact our day-to-day life and our ability to do things like meet deadlines, to prioritize the work to be completed, to regulate our emotions, and to inhibit our responses to those emotions, to organize our belongings to keep our rooms tidy, to organize our thoughts on paper when writing essays, to hold information in our heads, to use that working memory, to keep time or to really understand the concept of time, and then also to think flexibly. So I'm going to ask you again, which of these challenges do you or your children struggle with? So if you wouldn't mind filling out this, I think you should be able to do more than one, I hope. But if you can fill out which of these challenges is most challenging for you and your children, that would just help me also to pitch this correctly. Great. Across the board there, organizing thoughts on paper, meeting deadlines, prioritizing work to be completed, regulating emotions, and organizing belongings. Okay, we've got one adding in there, keeping time in there as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So you can see it's not just one thing that affects us. It was all these things kind of mixed together. And I always say to people that the executive function profile is complex, and it's complex for two reasons. Firstly, because different people experience it in different ways. And secondly, because depending on certain environmental factors, our executive functions strengthen and weaken depending on how well we're looking after ourselves, really, in our self-care as well. And I'll come on to that more in a moment. So we work with these executive functions. We work with the 11 that Peg Dawson in her work talks about, executive function skills. And there's the core executive function, which is the brain processes. And they are a working memory, response inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. And they kind of cross over in real life and work together to form these skills that we can actually measure, and we can develop these skills that sit alongside those brain functions. I'm not going to go through each one, but you can get an idea of what they are. So just thinking now about executive function skills and learning. So they are so absolutely important for learning. Just sitting still in a classroom and not speaking out of turn and remember to put our hand up and wait to be asked by a teacher requires metacognition, response inhibition, emotional control, so many different executive functions, ability to self-reflect. And we've got this little thing here of self-reflection of like how I've done in my work, and self-assessment requires metacognition, emotional control, and so many other executive functions. Essay writing, now this was a big one for me. I remember being at Cambridge and they were all just saying, you've just got to write a logical essay, a logical argument. And I was like, please just tell me what you mean by that, because I just didn't understand what they meant. I was trying to fit in everything I knew about a subject into an essay, when what they needed me to do was to prioritize the information that I needed to put in there. And so with that lens of understanding there's an issue with prioritization rather than not being able to form a good argument, because actually I was very good at arguing verbally, then it became much easier for me to understand how to write an essay. And actually essays are very easy to write if you know the core skills that you need to put into them, if you develop that planning and prioritization and that organization of your thoughts on the paper. Homework, I mean, so many executive functions in homework. I know you've all been doing a lot of home learning recently, but task initiation, planning and prioritization, time management, goal-directed persistence, sustained attention, they're just all in there. You just have so much in homework. And that makes it really challenging for children who have executive function challenges to keep up with their peers if there's a lot demanded of them in terms of homework. And that comes into revision as well. Revision is so embedded in our executive functions, and we just need pretty much all of them. You can't really filter out any that you don't need in order to be good at revision and to have that knowledge ready to regurgitate in an examination. And then obviously we've got exams there as well. And, you know, the big one for me that I found with the students that we work with is the anxiety around exam performance can really get in the way of our executive functions working. So we can be a really great student when we're in class, but when we have an examination, it can all go out the window, and we can perform really poorly compared with what we should have done. But that's because we're really struggling with our emotional regulation and are inhibiting our responses to our emotions. And often, you know, our time management and so many other things that get in there as well. Okay, so one more question now, just to ask you about which age range do you think the human brain is considered to be fully mature? So could you just, if you know, please just put where you think it is. And if you're not sure, just take a guess. Okay, wonderful. So we've got one person saying early 20s there. Brilliant. One person saying late 20s. Good. We're all in the ballpark. Fabulous. One person saying late teens. Okay, good. Nice spread across there. So I'm going to let you into a little secret, is that the person who said late 20s was actually correct, and that there's been a lot of research to show that our brains don't fully develop, especially our prefrontal cortex, where our executive functions are housed, until our late 20s. And that's in neurotypical brains as well. So for those who have neurodevelopmental disorders, it means they develop slower or they take time to develop. It can be even later than that as well. So we need to bear that in mind when we're thinking of what we're asking students to do in their earlier years. And I've just got a little chart here of these girls getting older and what they're able to do. So those initial executive functions, the working memory, cognitive flexibility, and response inhibition come online quite early. But it's not till kind of when we get to going to school for the first time, and in those first few years of school, that our emotional control, sustained attention, and cognitive flexibility, you know, really start to develop. And so that's when we're talking about the flexibility here, it's slightly different from the cognitive flexibility, because it's about, you know, being able to shift from one task to another. And you'll know as parents, I'm sure, from when you're asking a child to do one task and they find it really difficult to shift and move and do another task. And also that kind of emotional control piece, you know, we'll know as parents, you know, that you wouldn't be sending a 2-year-old into a school environment because, you know, they really struggle with their emotional control and they're having tantrums and they're living in their emotional brains quite a lot of the time. So interestingly, it's not till we get to kind of secondary school, so high school, that our task initiation, so that's like the opposite of procrastination, getting started on tasks, planning and prioritization, and organization skills start coming online and fully mature. But it's really this one, the other side here, the time management, goal-directed persistence, which remember is the same as kind of grit or resilience, and metacognition don't fully develop until our mid to late 20s. And so often we're asking young people to do things that their brains haven't really developed to do, or we're examining them to do things that only exceptionally or highly developed brains will be able to do, and kind of measuring achievement and ability based on these cognitive functions which haven't fully matured yet. So I personally feel that we need to do some some deep thinking about that and the way that we examine young people, because we need to be making sure that, you know, it's fair for everyone. But that time management piece, that ability to really kind of understand the passing of time and the concept of time. You know, I was just saying earlier to a colleague, you know, my 5-year-old has absolutely no concept of time, and that's fine. She's 5, but it still doesn't develop fully until our late 20s, when we really understand, you know, the concept of time and planning ahead, and why it's important to do to have a plan and to have an idea of what we want to do. And yes, some young people can do that earlier, but that's because they have abnormally strong time management skills for their age. So just some insights there to what we can expect of young people. So one of the questions that we get asked a lot at Connections in Mind is like, well, that's just who they are, isn't it? That's just, you know, my child is always going to have a weak working memory, or they're always going to struggle to remember tasks, or they're going to struggle to remember their homework. And actually, no, the neuroscience is really, really clear on this. That every single person on this planet's brain is malleable and can change, and we can all do things different. Now, this doesn't mean changing our personality. We're still whoever we are, but actually it's about working on the things that get in the way of us reaching our goals, and helping us to develop stronger executive functions, or French skills, or tennis skills, or whatever it is. We can all learn and develop no matter what age we are. The research does show, though, it's harder that older we get. That's because our automated kind of habits are more embedded. So it's more difficult to move away from those habits and to move on to a different path. And so we just need to remember that at the age of kind of the adolescence, when we're supporting them to get into, you know, secondary school, college, university, that's their prime time for developing the stronger executive functions. I'm just going to show us a short video now, hopefully, if it'll work. So don't worry, you don't have to go to the code on this one. I'm just going to show you this video, hopefully. There we go. So Carly, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the neuroplasticity video in the chat. So if anyone wants to share this is on YouTube, so it's easy to get hold of.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain was pretty much fixed after childhood. But recent advances now tell us they were mistaken. The brain can, and does, change throughout our lives. We can mould it, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. But how does neuroplasticity work? Our brain is a bit like a computer circuit board. There are billions of pathways sending messages every time you feel, do, or think something. Some of these pathways are like superhighways. These are our habits, our embedded ways of being. Every time we think in a familiar way, complete a particular task, or feel a certain emotion, we widen the pathway, and it becomes easier for our brains to send these messages. Now, if we think about something from another perspective, try a new task, or choose a different emotion, we start treading a new pathway. And if we keep using that path, it gets wider and smoother, becoming a superhighway. And this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway is bypassed and deteriorates. This is neuroplasticity in action. No matter how old we are, we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. It takes effort and regular repetition, but everyone can rewire their brains to create new superhighways.
Okay. Just try to get off. There we go. Super. So hopefully that just really showed you about neuroplasticity and how our brains can change. And I think it's a great one to share with young people too. So hopefully, Carly, you've shared that link and people can share that with young people, just to help understand that we're not fixed and we can change the way that our brains work and the habits that we have. But it does take effort. It's not easy. And I'm not sitting here saying, oh, it's so easy, you can just do things differently and have different habits. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is really hard and it takes regular repetition to do that. So I want to think now about the rule of 60. So there's a lot of research into habit formation and how long it takes to form a new habit. And often people feel like, well, if you've been working on something for a month or so, then it should become second nature. But actually, the neuroscience is very, very clear that on average, it takes 60 iterations of something for it to become a habit. So that means that we need to be supporting our young people to do something for 60 times before it becomes a habit. And if we have children with attention difficulties, then we really need to be scaffolding to do that in a way that makes it really engaging for them. So sometimes using a reward to help form that neural pathway is okay. And that doesn't need to be something massive. It can be something like getting to choose the takeaway on a Friday night or whatever it is, a small privilege within the household, which can help to incentivize them to make change. But it does take a lot of effort and time to make these changes. And just moving on from that now to have a think about what influences executive functions. And this is really relevant to the world that we're living in today. So stress, exercise, sleep, and nutrition all affect the way that our brains work and the ability of our executive functions to control our instincts, because that's basically what they're doing. They're helping us to have higher order thinking skills, to think things through, to plan ahead. Now, if we're stressed, if we haven't exercised, if we haven't slept well, or if we're hungry, and this is where the concept of hangry, I think every parent knows hangry, when your child is really, really hungry and you can't console them for anything. They just, tantrums and tears and everything. And this is where this comes in, is because when our basic needs aren't being met, our brain disconnects our executive functions from our instincts, and we're living in our more instinctual part of our brain. So it will be very, very difficult for anyone who's experiencing high levels of stress or depression or anxiety, they're not sleeping well and they're not eating well, and they've not done any exercise. It's going to be even harder for someone who's in that zone not to be able to start bringing their executive functions online and to develop stronger executive functions. So it's really important to remember that when we're thinking of developing stronger executive functions. But they can be developed. And I want to focus for the next few minutes on how we can do that, because I think it's really, really important in light of what we're going through at the moment, to really consider how hard it is for young people to just get by right now, because they're living under extreme stress, because this is an unprecedented pandemic where our parents don't even know what's happening, and they can't give us reassurance that we'll be back at school, or that there's definitely exams are going to happen next year. We just don't have any certainty. So that stress can really lead on to weakening our executive functions and having more challenges than we would do normally as well. And Carly, I wonder if you could share the link. I'm not sure if you've got that there, but there is a link on our Connections in Mind learning site to an interview that I did with Professor Adele Diamond, who is the foremost research into executive functions globally, and she's based out of Canada. And she's very, very clear that this pandemic will be having an undue impact on our executive function, something we won't have experienced before. So it's going to be harder to do all of the things that we've talked about today than in normal times. And that when our children are moving back into their kind of normal lives, as hopefully we all get back to normal, they're going to need more support to develop their executive functions than other children in other times gone by where they didn't have this stress. So what can we do to develop strong executive functions? So that's why you're all here today, I'm sure. So we need to understand brain development first of all. So it's understanding the parts of the brain, so the prefrontal cortex, and how it's controlling our instincts. That's really important. And then also understanding our executive functions and what they are. And that piece about neuroplasticity is really important, because if you understand neuroplasticity, then this concept of growth mindset is just second nature, right? Because if we know that we can always change and do better, then the idea of a fixed mindset it doesn't have any ground to stand on, because you know that your brain is plastic and you can improve. And developing shared executive function literacy is really important, just talking about the challenges. And it's this granular approach of really being able to talk about the specific challenge that the young person's face, not just they're disorganized, because that covers everything, but actually when we talk about organization, it's to do with belongings, organization of belongings, or or thoughts on a page or something like that. So it's the organization of things. Whereas with in terms of disorganized, instead of in terms of like not getting started on stuff and time management, that's different, and you can talk about this specifically in terms of those specific skills that need to be developed. Autonomy for the child is really important. Now, the thing is, when as parents, and I'm a parent of 3, so I know exactly how this feels. It's so easy to want to jump in all the time and do things for our children, but autonomy is the absolute foundation of stronger executive functions. And so my 9-year-old, she can cook a whole roast dinner. She's very British. She can cook a whole roast dinner. She's brilliant at baking cakes, following recipes, doing all of these things. And yes, there are risks associated with that, but she has learned over the years. I have taught her and scaffolded her and developed so she understands those risks, and occasionally she will get a small burn or something like that, but she won't do anything particularly dangerous because she knows how to use a knife, she knows how to use the cooker, and she is responsible. So developing that autonomy is so important around chores at home, but also around our schoolwork and decisions that we make as well. Active goal setting is important, so setting goals as a family, and structured support, which decreases over time. So if we feel that we can't at this stage step back, and I wouldn't recommend just suddenly taking the stabilizers off, the training wheels off, as it were, but I would say just slowly and reducing the scaffolding and support that we're offering our young people is really important. And there is a step-by-step guide. So this Smart but Scattered Teens is the book that gave me my light bulb moment. They have a kids version as well, and there's also an adult version too. So do have a look at that. It's very available on all online book retailers. So have a look at that as well. So the 3 stages I want to talk about today in this last few minutes before we get into the Q&A, and just to remind you, please do put any questions you have as they come up into the chat box there. So we've got the 3 stages here. So connect first. We're called connections in mind for a reason. Connecting with our young people and helping them to feel heard and feel seen and feel valued is really important as parents to help develop those executive functions. If they feel safe, those executive functions will come online. They'll be able to override their instincts and they'll be able to start learning and developing. Collaborating, so that's working with our young people, not telling them what to do, which is really hard because our parents all told us what to do, but we're asking you to think in a more progressive way about collaborating with young people to help them to come up with solutions that work for them. And then supporting them, so being that scaffolding, those training wheels, those stabilizers to keep them on the right track, but not smothering them with too much support as well. So it's a fine balance. So I'm going to give you 2 tips for each of these, and you'll see them in your handout as well. And then I've got some strategies and things that you can use within that handout as well that you can see, which has got some resources and things that you can use and print out and work on with your young people. So the first step is empathy. And Carly, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the empathy course in the chat, please. So we are real firm believers in empathy, and those of you who are interested in learning more, Brene Brown is a fantastic research into vulnerability and leadership and the importance of empathy in leadership. And so this is a really important skill to model to young people, but also to help them to develop themselves. But I'm talking about empathizing with your young people and helping them to understand it's okay to have executive function challenges. It's human, it's natural, it's normal, and mum and dad do just as much as you do. So empathy and feeling with someone is really important. If you want to learn this critical skill, we've got a link to a course there that you can have a look at. We need to connect with them in terms of our emotions. And this is something that I think we have the Victorians to blame for this, but we're very good in the Western world and not talking about emotions. And I think, they did a survey of people's emotional literacy, and on average, people only can recognize 3 emotions. But of course, there are myriads of different emotions. So using something like this resource that I've got for you in your packs, the zones of regulation, which has lots and lots of research behind it, to proven to really help young people to help to regulate their emotions, is thinking about the different zones. We've got the green, the blue, the yellow, the red, the progress as you'd expect. So we're starting off with happy, content, feeling okay, focused, ready to learn, and then ending up in mad, angry, mean, terrified, yelling, hitting, out of control, and then everything in between. So helping them to identify where they are. So you can use this by sitting down if someone is in that emotional state and helping them, sitting down and how are you feeling? Can you point to which zone you're in for me? Or can you just verbalize which zone you are in for me? Because that helps to develop that shared literacy. And you'll see on your handouts as well, we've got some strategy cards that go along those so that you can help to think about the strategies that work at moving you between the different zones of regulation too. So moving on to collaborate stage now. And I can't tell you how hard it was to find a picture of a boy loading the washing machine, but they were all little girls loading the washing machine. And this is the only one that I could find. And isn't it lovely? He's loading the washing machine with his father. But building in autonomy to our child's lives, getting them to do chores, getting them to plan their homework, getting them to plan the next family trip, wherever you're going once, COVID is finished, or even, writing a list to go grocery shopping with. That kind of autonomy is so fundamental to developing executive function. So next time you're doing something that you find quite menial and like, oh gosh, I've got to do that, just think about the opportunity for your child of teaching them how to do it. And the younger children, I'm not talking necessarily about teens, but if you get it started with younger children, they are absolutely delighted to be able to be asked to help with these things, like sorting the colors for the laundry, filling up the washing machine, adding the washing liquid or powder and switching it on. They just think it's the best thing ever. And that's helping them to develop those skills. So eventually they'll be able to do it themselves, and they'll be able to use the kind of self-regulation skills, the task initiation, the time management, the emotional control, response inhibition when they just want to walk off, and use those skills as part of their development. So autonomy is really, really key. And then also asking questions. So there's a reason why we use a coaching approach at Connections in Mind. And that is because questions let the brain make its own connection. So if you think of a new neural pathway being formed in the brain of a young person, it doesn't necessarily get formed if you just tell someone what to do, because they're just following directions. So they're just holding the instructions in their working memory, and they're not necessarily forming a new neural pathway in their brain that stores it in their long-term memory. But if we ask questions and say that something like, for example, it's about packing the washing machine we were just talking about, we're saying, so what's the first step? So rather than first of all you split the colors, what's the first step? And they've got to remember, okay, the first step is splitting the colors, and then you can check with them. But asking questions rather than telling is a really, really important part of the collaboration stage of working on developing executive functions. Now moving on to support. Now Russ Barkley is the foremost kind of research into ADHD and executive function. So he has written lots and lots of books about how to parent children with executive function challenges or ADHD, and he uses them interchangeably, those two terms. The most important thing for him is to remember that we are not engineers as parents. We get the child we were given. We don't get the child we had in our mind when we were, growing that beautiful baby. We get the child we were given, and we get the brain that we were given, and we have to work with that. But it's not us to be the engineer and to make choices for them and to structure things so much that they can't be autonomous, they can't develop their own skills, be independent. Our role is instead to be a shepherd. And I really like that, because it's about keeping them safe and making sure they're in safe environments so that they can flourish and grow. But within those boundaries that we've set up for them, they can make their own decisions and they can behave as they wish within those environments. So leading them to the safe pastures, making sure they've got good food to eat and water, making sure that you're looking after their welfare in terms of their physical welfare and their mental health as well is really, really important. But it's not a case of us kind of engineering these children. So we need to think about that when we're making decisions for them, putting them in environments that are helping them to flourish, and not putting them in environments which cause them stress, that they don't sleep well and that they don't eat well. So putting them in those environments that help them to develop stronger executive functions. And the final thing on support is our working memory. Now, if you have executive function challenges, your working memory is normally compromised. And that's just something that goes along with executive function challenges, not for everyone, but across the board, it seems to be the most common thing. And so setting up these checklists for young people is really important. And you'll see that we put a morning checklist, like an example on there for teens for you. You know, make it relevant to them, get them to do it. The checklist, don't you do it, but get them to think about what the checklist is, put emojis on there, make it fun, make it relevant to them, straightening their hair or doing the lipstick or whatever it is, make it relevant to them, and then they will follow it. But if it's something that you do to them, then they won't. But also just scaffolding that working memory and making sure it's easy to access is really important. So how can we help? So we obviously, this is our thing. We're really interested in executive functions. We believe that by harnessing our executive functions, we can be the best that we can be. But we do know that in order to develop strong executive functions, you need to have really strong goal-directed persistence, and having someone to support you can make all the difference. And that's why we offer coaching. And we offer coaching rather than tutoring or training, because coaching asks questions and holds people accountable to working towards specific measurable goals. And that's the work that we do at Connections in Mind. So we have a group of expert coaches who are really experienced in working with young people. They're professional coaches, so they've done separate coach training to when they come to work with us. So they've been life coaches or so on and so forth before. And then they have had specific training from us, and we have like a world-class executive function coach training course, which we have people from all over the world. In fact, we're running one at the moment. We've got people from Australia, Mexico, America, everywhere on our course. And then we also offer ongoing supervision and training to these coaches as well. So it's not just like they get trained and then off they go, but they're constantly once a month having a meeting with our supervisor, who is a trained counsellor, so she can support from a mental health perspective, and making sure that the young people that we're working with are being really supported. But the most important part of the work that we do is this measurable, goal-focused approach. Not it's about really making progress. So it's you can measure and see the outcomes and the development of young people in developing their executive function skills. There we go. And then finally, just to say that this approach, just to remind you that everyone has executive function strengths and weaknesses. So if you're sitting here because there's got one child that you're particularly keen to get some support in this, everyone can also benefit from it. And so a whole family approach is the best way forward, because we can all boost our productivity, help develop lifelong learning skills, improve our mental health, our relationships, and our sense of achievement. So just to say quickly before we finish, so these are, we're on all of these channels, and our Facebook groups are there full of free resources. Charlie, if you wouldn't mind putting the Facebook groups on there, there's one for parents and one for adults on there. And then if you'd like to get in contact with me or the team, so there's my email address and then the team email address there for you to get in contact too. Sorry, Rachel, we've just run over a little bit on the time there, but hopefully not too much. I wonder if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Victoria. That was great. Let me turn my video back on so people can see that I'm speaking. That was really, really helpful. I have a couple of pre-submitted questions that I can ask now, and then if anyone in the audience wants to use the Q&A feature, you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you sort of hover your cursor down there, you should see Q&A, and you can submit anonymous questions if that's more comfortable. But for now, some of the questions that we had in advance were, so how can sort of parents encourage a growth mindset in their children? Could you talk a little bit more about specific ways that they can do that if, you know, maybe they're sort of new to the concept or maybe aren't quite where they want to be in terms of having a growth mindset for themselves?
Brilliant. Yeah, great question. And you know, a lot of schools do talk about a growth mindset, but don't actually live it. And I think as a family, like living a growth mindset is really, really important. So the first thing is really understanding neuroplasticity, because neuroplasticity is the neuroscience behind growth mindset. If we know that we can change our brains, then we know that growth mindset can happen, and that we can change and develop. And it's all about the effort that we put in. And the second thing is thinking about praising. So there's a lot of research to do with praise, and how praise is the most important part of developing a growth mindset. And instilling any kind of change in any behavior or any habits that we have. So if we praise young people, not for the outcome, not for the doing of the thing and completing it and get it done, well, that's brilliant, that's great, but also sometimes it's just the effort too. So if they've tried really hard to do something but they still not quite managed to do it, recognizing that and praising the effort and not the outcome is really important. Because if you find something easy, if you just praise the outcome, you're just reinforcing, okay, it's good to do that thing. But if you praise the effort and say, you tried really hard at that, I can see that your brain is growing, and it's really effortful, isn't it, to learn these new things, then young people really take that on board. And I had one of those moments the other day as my 9-year-old came up to me and said, nobody wants to do kayaking anymore. They're all saying it's too hard. But I said to them, learning is hard. And if you want your brain to grow, you have to do hard things. And I was like, yes. So for me as a parent who knows about growth mindset, that was things. So saying things like you can do hard things and praising effort is really important for that. And also having that growth mindset about yourself too, as well, because that will trickle down into the young people too.
Thank you. I've got another question. So if you have, sort of tried everything that you've been talking about so far, and, I think maybe you're at a point where you're not sure what else to do, is there a point where maybe it would make sense to seek medical treatment or to get, I don't know, a GP or someone else involved in that, on that end as well?
So yes, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't give any specific advice on that, but our experience has been that the medication that is available to help with ADHD can be really helpful in improving the concentration, and so that you can get things done, but it doesn't develop skills, right? So it only does so much, and you still need to work on developing the skills. But what can happen is that if you're able to concentrate more on things, that you're more able then to concentrate on developing your executive functions. But what I would also say is to really, really think carefully about what is the cause of these executive function challenges. It could be something that's genetic and definitely then the medication route, but is there something else? Is there some stress that's getting in the way, and some other things that needs to be taken out of that stress needs to be taken out for a bit. And this young person that I was working with, that caused me to have my light bulb moment when I spoke to that psychiatrist, she was on this thing of, they tried everything that were trying to help her, but she was still on the pathway of like, you've got to get this and you've got to do this and you've got to do that and you've got to do that. So there was never any time for her to just be her and to let those executive functions come online. So I don't know your particular history of this particular child, but just ask that question, is the environment they're in helping to reinforce these poor executive functions because they're feeling stressed all the time and anxious? And if that is the case, then consider moving them out of that environment. And we've seen quite a lot of benefits from people doing like wilderness therapy and things like that, where they just get away from all of the stimuli and just allow that brain to start developing naturally. So that would be something also to consider as well. But there's some options.
Great. Have another question. What would you recommend for families where the relationship is maybe already a bit strained and there's that tension that already exists, and so the parents are maybe a bit wary of trying to offer any other advice or to try new tactics because they just don't think that they're going to get a very warm reception, and their child gets quite upset when help is offered, and the parents aren't really sure how to sort of reset that relationship and move forward.
It's really hard. And let me just say that parenting children with executive function challenges is uniquely challenging. And, we totally get that at Connections in Mind. So please don't take anything I've said today as like, oh, all you've got to do is empathize with your child and then everything will be fine. It's not, it's really hard. And especially the older they are, the more embedded those habits of your parenting and their responses to that. And, all of that kind of gets mixed up in it. So what I would say, the two things that I would recommend, we have a parent course, an online parent course, which can take you right back to the basics of the neuroscience and then building on that and strategies, practical strategies you can use at home. But also what we find, and the reason we set up Connections in Mind, is that the research clearly shows is that around the age of adolescence is that children are looking for people outside of the home as role models and mentors, which is probably why you guys are working with ESM Prep, because you recognize the value of having somebody outside of the home that they have a bond with, that they want to work with. And so coaching can work in the same way. And we have these, expert coaches who are specifically trained to develop these executive functions and to get these kids motivated. And if you're facing kind of issues with motivation, like, oh, they really don't want to change, we have a program that we can do with them, which is what we call our metacognition building course, which is to help them to understand why it might be beneficial for them to work on coaching. And then they can move into coaching after that. So that is an option as well, for those who are quite resistant to support and wanting help. So there are options out there. I just encourage you to reach out, because we can help. If we can, we will.
Great. Got another question here. Do you need to rest these executive function skills, I guess? Is it something that can be taxing on students as they're going about their day, as they're learning? Do they need to sort of take a break from this at all?
Yes, absolutely. So we think of the brain uses glucose, and it is the biggest consumer of glucose within the body. And when we're using our executive functions, it definitely does consume a lot of glucose. Now, if you are forming new neural pathways and embedding those, that takes even more glucose in the brain. So when you're developing these new skills, little and often is the most important thing. So there's another expert interview on our CIM learning site that you might want to have a look at with Peg Dawson when I interviewed her. And she was so great. She was just like, the best intervention for executive function development is something that takes less than 10 minutes a day. So if you can just do 10 minutes a day of something to help boost the skill, that is the most important thing. But doing it all day long will be exhausting. But also remember, just building on your point as well, is that with young people who struggle with these executive functions or have challenges in this area, being in a school environment where you're expected to have neurotypical executive functions is really exhausting. So you get home from school and you're so tired. All you want to do is go on YouTube and text your mates and watch Netflix. But actually then you've got to do homework on top of that. And your brain is so taxed and so tired that you can't engage those executive functions. So just keeping up with their peers can be really, really exhausting. So a lot of the students we work with, we kind of build in this time. One of my students calls it lumping. And, just that time to restore, to find out what is restorative for the young person. And it can be something as mindless as Netflix or YouTube or whatever it is that they're finding interesting. Obviously within boundaries, and that's what we're talking about, the shepherding, within certain boundaries is really important. But working out what is restorative for them is really important to help regenerate those executive functions so they're there when they need them for the next school day. But also speaking to teachers about the volume of homework that's being done and whether it all needs to be done. Like, what is the most critical bits of this that need to be done? Because let's focus on that part of the learning rather than just getting it done for the sake of it, because that's not necessarily always that helpful.
Great. I think we've got one more question, unless anyone else has anything that they haven't had time to ask. But so someone has asked, if the last few months have been very stressful, but they're sort of also cognizant of the fact that there are even more deadlines coming up, even more exams coming up. How do they find the balance between supporting their student and but also kind of making sure that she doesn't fall behind in all of these upcoming tasks?
It's so hard, isn't it? And I think this is the hardest thing for me as a leader in this field, is that I know that the best thing to recommend right now is that they stop, that they take some time out and they have time for their brains to come back online so that they can work their optimal capability. But society doesn't stop, expectations don't stop, the system doesn't stop. And so it's about finding that balance. So as a parent, when your child is getting burnt out. You'll know when it's too much for them, but just watch really carefully and don't push too far, because if you push too far, all the wheels are going to come off and then you're going to have to repeat the year anyway, right? So it's about finding that balance, talking to them, developing that emotional literacy, developing that feedback loop and collaborating, so that it is within boundaries that they also understand as well, and that they're bought into, because they're much more motivated to do it if they've come up with it too, rather than just something that's done to them. So yeah, a really tricky question, and I feel for you it's a really hard path to tread.
All right, I think that's the end of our questions for now. So thank you all for asking those. And thank you, Victoria, of course, for this presentation. I think it was very educational and encouraging, and it's something that, you know, is a very difficult topic, no matter sort of what the details are. So we do have lots of things to download, links to click, and so on. If you've missed any of those, please feel free to reach out to any of us, either Victoria herself, or if you sort of go indirectly through ESM Prep, we're more than happy to connect you to Victoria and her team. Any other sort of last words, Victoria?
No, I think just to reiterate what I said earlier, this is hard. It's really hard. We're here to support you. ESM Prep are here to support you too. You know, we're on this journey together, and yeah, and just keep strong, but also feel those emotions with your young people. And it's okay to be scared and frightened and angry and frustrated and all those things. We don't have to be positive all the time. And if you're interested in learning more about what I just said, the Dare to Lead podcast is a great one for parents. And Brene Brown, I don't know if you're fans of her, but she's doing this really great Dare to Lead podcast. And the last couple of episodes were about emotional agility and toxic positivity. So I really recommend that for some podcast listening. All right, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have great days. And do let any of us know if you have questions. So.
Okay. Bye, everybody.